that because of the conditions of life in that time, and this happened with Japanese and Chinese after they graduated from school, they still had to go back to the jobs that they had working their way through college. So anyway, that was part, these are part of the things. The community that I grew up in was different, and maybe I should explain to you. I live in Seattle. The ratio of men to women coming over to the United States early on was 94% male, 6% female. Now just figure that out in your brain. What does that mean? What kind of conditions is that going to set up sociologically? You can imagine what it is. They were coming, the age of the men coming over here was approximately, they were around 14 to 22, that was the average age. They weren't all single. 24% of the men had families back in the Philippines. However, that means that most of them were not. The Philippines is a family-oriented society. So what happens is, that song, where you're not near the one you love the one you're near. And so consequently what happened all over the United States, wherever it was possible, we had Filipino men marrying women of other races. When I was growing up in Seattle on the West Coast, in Western United States, there were only 2 states that didn't have anti-miscegenation laws, the law that forbid you to marry someone other than, marry whites. And so kids that I grew up with were basically mestizos. And because I'm from the Northwest, a lot of them were Scandinavian. But a lot of other kids, the kids that I grew up with are either Filipino, Scandinavian, Irish, Filipino Native Americans, because we had a lot of Native Americans up there, even from the Alaska, natives from Alaska, from all over. Filipino African Americans. This was the community I grew up in, where there were mestizos. But because what happens is, and even with Filipino Japanese, if those women married a Filipino, 9 times out of 10, they were ostracized by their family. And so the community I grew up in, and I wish I had brought pictures of those days, the social pictures that you have Filipino men and their non-Filipino wives. They became Filipino because that's who accepted them. That was a community I grew up in, a community that was mixed, but a community that also, all over the United States, we lived in ghettos, the places that we were allowed to live in. A lot of times, the Filipinos who come here now, they don't understand that because, I can live anywhere I want, I got the money, I can do it. But that was a different time, the time that I grew up in. I grew up in the Great Depression. I was born right in the middle of the Great Depression. And during that time, so we would ask the people, I was very interested in several things when I started my first world history. How did you survive? How did you survive discrimination in a country where you thought you were equal? Because that's what you were taught when you were taught by your American teachers in the Philippines, that all men are created equal, okay? Then how did you survive during the Great Depression? And the stories that I heard, that I gathered, that we all gathered, my team of researchers, was interesting. During the Great Depression, Filipinos shared whatever they had. One woman said, I went to the public market. We have a famous market in Seattle. And she said, I love this food. And there was Daddy and me and Jimmy and my brother. But I cooked for 17 because you never know who's coming for dinner. And that's exactly the way it was. People just naturally accepted the fact that someone would drop in for dinner. Other people who lived in the Chinatown, because that's where many of the bachelors would live, I'd ask them, okay, Uncle, I know not everybody had a job, so what they said is, if somebody had a job, he would rent a room. And this happened so many times, it had to be true. Sometimes there would be anywhere from 6 to 12 people in the room, and I said, where do they sleep? Well, the room's available 24 hours a day. They would take turns sleeping, but the whole thing was, whoever rented the room got the bed. So they would always, it was a matter of sharing. There were organizations back in those days. This was a community that I grew up in where it was truly community. They took care of each other. I don't see that anymore. You know, it appalls me. But these people, even the people who shared hotel rooms, I said, well, were you all related? They said, no. Some of them was a friend of a friend, maybe a cousin, or somebody who didn't have a place, and they just invited them in. We had gambling houses, Filipino gambling houses, and this is what they did. Should have been gambled. But the proprietors would do this. In the morning, they would serve coffee and donuts, and then in the evening, they would provide chop suey and rice. So there was sort of this self-help thing that people did. The other thing too that was interesting is Filipinos learned to live off the land. And I thought, and I'm talking more West Coast, you know, and even probably Hawaii, and Edwina can correct me on this, but they learned to live off the land, and they learned a lot from the Native Americans. In the Northwest and wherever, they learned to forage for things, you know, things that people thought were weeds, were the vegetables they cooked with. They farmed. My husband's family grew up, my husband grew up in California. I'm from Seattle, but he's from California. We met in college. And the thing is, he learned to hunt. So they were, you know, it was, it was rabbits, jackrabbits or whatever. Up in the Northwest, we fished. We dug clams. We did all these things. They went squiggling for eels. They harvested all of these different things that people didn't want to eat before but eat now. My father and mother had a little restaurant, and how they provided food during the Depression years inexpensively is they would go to the pack houses. In the old days, they were throwaways, the feet, the pigtail, you know, all those things. You went to the fish market, they threw away the head, the stomach, you know, all these things that people want now, because that's probably one of the tastiest parts. Those were things that were free. People ate these things. There was a case of people living by their wits during the Depression. People think that during those times too, even though we were discriminated against and we lived in ghettos or whatever, there was a society. We had each other. There were clubs. One thing about Filipinos is they join an organization. They get a chance to be president. Somebody told me the other day, if they're not going to be president, they'll start another club so they may become president of that club. And I'm not kidding you, that's true. But everywhere around this country, what we found, there were Filipino communities. And what was interesting, because we spoke all these different dialects, we're probably one of the only Asian groups, or one of the only immigrant groups, where a meeting of immigrants was conducted in English. Because if they spoke their dialects, the other person couldn't understand, and a fight may break out. So since they all were told, once the Americans came in, and they were trained by the Thomasites in English only, because the school that my parents went to, you had to speak English. I mean, that was the medium of instruction. So they came, you know, they understood it. So all the meetings were in English. So it was just interesting. We had all of these. The thing that was interesting about the Filipinos is people would say, "Oh, Filipinos like to eat, and they like to dance." Yeah, we do. And that was just part of the culture. And I think to this day, in the colleges, the kids, the big deal are their PCC night. It was maybe a way when I reflect back not to be too hard on my people, because sometimes I could get really hard and say, God, all I want is a good time. But it wasn't. It was a way that they dealt with what was here. When they danced, they remembered their old country. It was a good time. The thing that we learned as we were going through the research, we found out that the men who were coming here, especially, were earning very little. We have a movie called 10 cents an hour diamond hands. Okay, the 10 cents an hour is how much they earn working in the fields. And that's back-breaking work. And Filipinos, the stoop labor. Filipinos were good at stoop labor. One man who worked in Montana said after he went to Alaska, because they were migrant workers in the truest sense. Many of the old-time Filipinos worked in the fields, set up the crops, That was in the spring. And then in late spring and summer, they'd go up to Alaska, work in Alaska, process the fish, come down and harvest crops. And then they go all over again, just like that. So for many of them, where did they live? For many of them, they attached themselves to a family which was really their family, or a family who came from their hometown, and that was where their address was. They didn't have an address, many of them, but they had a connection. And so this is the community that I was researching back in those days. But it changes, you know, as you go along. The community, our men were single. The first riot that took place against Filipinos was in the state, we thought was in the state of Washington. And a lot of it was conducted by Ku Klux Klan. People don't think that. And I was appalled when I saw that. And the basic reason for that was two reasons. One, mingling with women who are white, and two, you're going to take away my job. And a lot of the time, taking away a job, I wouldn't have done it anyway. You know. So when you process that, it was pretty hard. And what's interesting in Yakima, we found out, even though those men had to hide in ditches to hide from the people, vigilantes who were coming with guns to shoot them or to burn their house, they stayed. And they created communities. They're still there today. And they're survivors. My people were survivors. We find Filipinos kind of, during the 70s, I used to do a lot of civil rights things. It was part of my job, you know. So I get on these little TV shows and talk about the problems that we had. My mother and dad would see the same show. My mother would, when I'd come home, Mom would say, "I'm so glad you said that." My dad would say, "Well, what do you expect? We're Filipino." The men accepted it many times because they had to go out in the workplace. They couldn't walk the boat. My mother could. She was home. So we think about that. When World War II started, I was going to a Japanese missionary school, well, we call it that. It was run by the Maryknoll Order. And they were teaching children who were Japanese, basically, and Filipino. It was 90% Japanese, 10% Filipino. My friends then, everything happened December 7th, a Sunday. So the next day I had to go to school. And the condition in the school was really hard because the Japanese kid knew something was up and we didn't know what to do. I was only 9. And these were my friends. They weren't the ones who dropped the bomb. And yet the day before that, there was a gathering at my mother's house where her sister had died in November, and that was the last day of the novena. So when I came home from Mass, all the people were listening to the radios. They were talking about bombing. So all of a sudden, these Filipinos who had lived with Japanese, many of them had worked for Japanese, who were farmers, all of a sudden they were the dirty Japs and everything. You know, and this really bothered a lot of us kids who were Filipino because we all went to school with Japanese kids up and down the coast. And then our friends were sent away to camp. And the World War II changed the status of Filipinos in many ways. All of a sudden, because of the bravery of the men on Bataan, Corregidor, Filipinos became heroes who are no longer called little brown monkeys, but now little brown brothers. Not only that, when World War II started, President Roosevelt signed into existence, which would eventually become the first and second Filipino infantries. The idea was they were going to go back and help in the liberation of the Philippines. So in my office, we have records, which are really interesting, that we retrieved from a basement. And they were the records of the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry, which was held by a man who was the PR person for the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry. In those records are handwritten, typewritten reports of the personal experiences of some of these men during that time. What the history books don't say about what Filipinos did during that war was there were hundreds of Filipino men out of the 7,000 who were identified early on by their white officers as to become part of infiltration groups who would go from New Zealand and Australia by submarine and to bring to the guerrillas in the Philippines things, ammunition, all kinds of equipment, and especially radios, so they could set up radio contact with MacArthur's headquarters in Australia. None of this is written in the history books. As far as they're concerned, Filipinos were the mop-up crew. Many of these submarines, and we have in there the orders written by the white officers, and the thing is written specifically as suicide mission, because some of them never made it. I mean, you had the Japanese submarines going everywhere, and they were blowing them up. So this is part of the history that we are going to start pushing out. I mean, lately there's been the thing of getting medals if you were in the Baton Corridor, but we've insisted in France that the men in the 1st and 2nd Infantry also get it. So this is part. So the war changed. We got marching up really quickly to the 40s. A lot of the Filipinos now who were left behind couldn't be in the service. They were told part of the war effort is food. They had to work in Alaska. They had to tend to the crop. They had to farm. And so even though they wanted to go and be in the Navy, the Air Force, or whatever, they were told no, they had to do that. The interesting thing is all the men who were in the service, we have pictures where you have 1,000 men standing there with their hands up like this. 1,000, and every one of the families would get pictures of one of our uncles, one of those 1,000 men in the picture. That picture must have been taken several times, because there were several times that this was done. That meant that they were becoming American citizens before they were being shipped overseas. It was something that was denied them prior to 1943, 44. They were given the opportunity to become American citizens. So by virtue of that, when the men went to the Philippines then, and they saw for the first time a lot of Filipino girls were sometimes 20 years younger than them. They were courting them and bringing back to the United States war brides, the second group of Filipino war brides to the United States. This started to rejuvenate Filipino communities all over the United States. Because all of a sudden now you had Filipino, and it was different. Before it was Filipino men and women of other races. You know, all the other Filipino women, they were married already, and if they were widowed, like my mother, she was married in 2 years. I mean, she had all kinds of people courting her. So we had all of these things, the community started to build. After the war also, there were other people coming immediately or even during World War II. As the tail end of the boat, I'll never forget, I was coming out of our mass and sitting on one of the side things of the church were these guys who looked like they looked like you, but they were speaking Tagalog. And I thought, what the heck? You know, who are these people? I was around 9 or 10 or 12, I think 12. They were the direct descendants of Americans who stayed in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, raised families. So when the war was ending, the United States government was trying to identify where the Americans are. Not just the white Americans, but any American. Those who were born in the United States whose parents may have brought them back, and I'll go back on that, or those who were the direct descendants of Americans who had remained in the Philippines. And some of them were the children and non-children. Let me just go back a little bit. We were American nationals up until, or my parents were American nationals until 1934, when there was, when Congress finally passed a law to change the status of Filipinos. What it was is double-edged sword. Make you a colony, in 10 years you will become an independent country. But by virtue of that, all Filipinos are no longer American nationals, you are now aliens. So overnight, my parents became aliens, who could not become citizens, who could not own property, who could not vote, but who could pay taxes. Okay. So that was a condition. Then there was a rider to that bill, around a year later. This is the rider. We have a bill where you can go back to the Philippines, we'll pay your way. A one-way ticket, you can't come back. There are over 50,000 of us here. Less than 2,000 took them up on that. They stayed for a number of reasons. Some of the people who were here had come to do grand things for the family, get an education, get a good job, everything like that. And they hadn't fulfilled it because the conditions weren't right for them. Others had married, they had family, they weren't going to go back. And so they decided to stay. At that time, you're going to see in the pass-up that I gave was a study made by a guy named John Berman. And he writes that all Filipinos wanted to go back. Many of them chose not to go back because they stayed. And they were part of the men then who eventually go and get their war rights agreement here. So we had those people, and then we had Baton Corregidor people coming in because many of them were given an opportunity to make a choice. Stay under the United States before the Philippines becomes an independent country, or remain there and remain a Filipino citizen with a new country that's called no longer the Philippine Islands, but the Philippines. And so Baton Corregidor survivors started to come, and they were bringing whole families over, starting in the 50s. At the same time, we're exchange workers and exchange students, many of them female. Now we still had a large body of bachelors here, Filipino bachelors. I'm just telling you who our family is. Now I wish I brought pictures of our Filipino men. They look good. I mean, they really did. When we see pictures of them, a lot of them wanted to look like the gangsters in the movies, you know, the slick back hair, and they had the zoot suits and everything. They looked sharp. My mom used to say, because my dad liked to take care of him, and said, look at your daddy, he has more makeup than I do. And that was true. My dad had many things in the bathroom. My mother had maybe powder and lipstick. But the men wanted to take care of themselves. So when these younger women came, and they hadn't married a woman from the Philippines, we started to have, all through the United States, these older men marrying these younger girls who were coming as exchange workers, exchange students. And the marriages many times were set up by some of the older women. They became yentas. They were setting up the marriages for their relatives. Our community now was growing slowly. At the same time, the second generation people like me were starting to get married, were starting to have families.